Hello, this is Representative Pam Powers Hanley. Welcome to my podcast, A View from the Left Side. For many years in the Arizona House, my seat was on the far left side of the chamber. As a progressive Democrat and one of the most independent representatives in the House, I always believed that was a fitting seat for me. This podcast features in-depth interviews with newsmakers from all walks of life, as well as political and social commentary. Thanks for joining me on the left side today. And now it's time for some good trouble. This week's View from the Left Side commentary. This week's podcast was recorded during the week of September 13, 2021. Near the end of the Obama administration, there was an opening on the Supreme Court because Antonin Scalia had passed away. This was about 6 months or so before the election. Republicans stopped the appointment of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court because they said the next president should determine who sits in that seat. The Supreme Court functioned for months with one seat vacant. As soon as President Trump was elected, they put somebody on the Supreme Court. During the Trump era, 3 appointees were put on the Supreme Court. Today, we are suffering from that time period. Today's podcast focuses on reproductive rights and Republican attacks on those rights nationwide. We will in particular look at the laws that were passed in Texas and the law that is coming up soon in Arizona. The legislature passed SB 1457 in 2021. It is due to become law soon. Women across the state are mobilizing against us. There are lawsuits that have been filed at the federal level against the Texas law and in Arizona against the Arizona law. It's a scary time for women in the United States. Have you ever seen the PBS series Call the Midwife? It's based on a book by a woman who was a public health midwife in London after World War II. It shows the effect of no birth control and no abortion on a woman's right to choose and on her life trajectory. You will see the lives of women upended by unintended pregnancy. You will see them binding their stomachs so they could keep their jobs. This was a very oppressive time because they did not have body autonomy. In 1970, when a series of states legalized abortion, they did so because so many women were dying from illegal abortions. We don't want to go back there. We don't want to go back to the backroom abortions. My guest today will break this all down. The lawsuits, the actions, the suppression of women. My guests today are Representative Athena Salmon and Diane Post. In the Arizona House, Representative Athena Salmon has proven herself to be an articulate champion for the civil rights, voting rights, and reproductive rights of Arizonans. She has served in the legislature since 2016. She's the former Democratic whip and current ranking member on the House Government and Elections Committee. Diane Post is an international human rights attorney who has lived in 6 countries, worked in 14, and continues to work for the human rights of women and girls. With the strongest attack on abortion rights in decades and a stacked Supreme Court, these are tense times for American women, particularly those who live in red states. Texas is in the spotlight now with their 6-week abortion ban and the deputized vigilantes to enforce it. But Arizona's SB 1457, which criminalizes doctors and patients, will become law soon unless it can be stopped in the courts. Welcome to my podcast, Athena and Diane. Athena, would you like to give us a little bit of background to start?
And thank you so much for that introduction and for having me today on the show, especially with Diane. We did a radio show together a couple weeks ago, and I feel like both of us were on fire. Also, just sounding the alarms about how dark this moment is. And honestly, unless we see some bold action from the federal government, things are just going to get darker and darker. To provide some context for people who are not familiar with the state of Arizona and where we're at, given in the backdrop of what happened to Texas. So Arizona is one of several states that prior to Roe v. Wade, we had outright bans on not only abortion, but we also had laws banning contraception, or as the state law puts it, devices that prevent conception, which is birth control. So these laws were being, challenged in the courts, and they were being upheld as recently as 2 weeks by the Court of the Appeals prior to the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. So after the court said that you can ban abortion and you can send women and doctors to prison for banning abortion, Roe v. Wade, the landmark decision, was issued by the Supreme Court, and then the Court of Appeals just went back to that case and amended it to say, okay, new precedent, so you can no longer enforce these laws. There are several states that still have these laws, like Arizona, on the books. There are several states that, including Arizona, that if Roe v. Wade gets completely overturned or gets rewritten by a court that is hostile to abortion care and reproductive freedom, these laws could then trigger back into effect, and your county prosecutor, your attorney general, and just the full force of the state can then start enforcing and going after individuals for certain forms of reproductive health care. And that's just based on what the state had prior to Roe v. Wade. That does not include, especially, I would say most rigorously, what we've seen on the abortion restrictions that the state has imposed over the last decade. I think that's when you really see, with the Tea Party movement, conservative movement, really double down and attack women's rights through the states. And so when you put in conjunction with all the laws that we have passed over the past 10 years, any diminishment of Roe v. Wade that the court does in Casey versus Planned Parenthood, it just means very, very bad news for people who have uteruses in Arizona, people who can become pregnant, or people who are currently pregnant and can be punished for the outcomes of those pregnancies, regardless of whether or not it was abortion, a stillbirth, a miscarriage. But yeah, so that's kind of big picture, bad news for Arizona right now.
Wow, Athena. Now I'm really worried. Thanks so much for giving us the historical perspective. Diane, you've been a civil rights lawyer for a very long time. Can you fill us in on the legal angles and the legal challenges to these anti-abortion laws?
Well, thank you very much for having me. And as a lawyer, of course, I want to focus on legal things. I do just want to respond to a couple of things you said, Athena, which is that we do need bold action. And as you know, the Department of Justice has sued Texas. And I do have a copy of that suit. And last night, they filed a motion for preliminary injunction. I don't have a copy of that yet. I just read this morning that they have, in fact, filed it. So I'll be waiting to see that. I would also say this is not a conservative movement. Many conservatives support contraception and abortion. It is a Christian nationalist movement by a very small percentage of the people. And that takes me to the three main legal arguments. There's religious arguments, there are medical arguments, and there are legal arguments. And obviously, the legal arguments have to incorporate the religious and the medical arguments. This is the belief, the dogma of one particular religion. And now everyone in the country, is asked to live by the dogma of one particular religion. Now, that is the violation of the separation of church and state, if ever there was one. But I want to point out one particular thing in the Texas law that most people who are not lawyers don't know about. We've been here before. We had non-state actors doing a job that the state could not legally do before. We had covenants, restrictive covenants on property, so that white people could not sell their property to Black people. This is when it was illegal for the state to prohibit discrimination, but individuals who were non-state actors could, or so they thought. So all over the country, there were restrictive covenants attached to your property. So if I wanted to sell my house, there would be an attachment. It would be in writing attached to my deed saying you cannot sell your house to an African American. Well, that was declared unconstitutional in a case called Shelley versus Kramer back in the 60s or the 70s, 60s, I think, because the state cannot do by private actors what it could not do itself legally. And the big point was that if the judges who are state employees enforce the law, that's state action. So that brings in your state action. That is exactly the same thing here with these bounty hunters. They have to sue in civil court, but if the judge upholds it, the judge is then a state actor committing an unconstitutional act against a woman who has a constitutional right to an abortion. So that is something most people don't know. And the other thing most people don't know is the $10,000 is a minimum. That's not the maximum. It's the minimum that they can receive. So there are many, many issues with this. And regarding SB 1457, there is an oral argument on the preliminary injunction to stop that on the 22nd of September. So we're now, Arizona State now is a plaintiff in that action, as are many other people, doctors and medical associations and the National Council of Jewish Women, also plaintiffs. So there is an argument on the 22nd, and we're hoping that that will put a preliminary injunction on that so it does not go into effect. And the arguments there are basically on the two main issues. The reason ban, women do not have to give a reason why they're having an abortion. We have a right to have an abortion pre-viability, and we don't have to give anybody a reason. So when Arizona State Legislature passed a law that said you got to name one of these 10 reasons, the 10th reason was, I'm not telling you. And that's what we told every woman to do. Just say, I'm not telling you, it's none of your business. So we don't have to give a reason. So that's the reason ban issue. And the other one is the personhood issue, trying to make a zygote, an embryo, a fetus, a child, an unborn child. Well, 25% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. So God must not be pro-life.
Could you compare and contrast what's going on in Texas and what's going on in Arizona? Because both of these laws are bad, and both of them will hurt women, and both of them will end up in illegal abortions, deaths of women, unnecessary hardship and poverty, lifelong hardship and poverty, particularly for young women. There was an article, I believe, in the New York Times recently about how much this Texas law would hurt pregnant teenagers in particular, and pregnant teenagers who are poor and in rural Texas. This goes the gamut of ruining people's lives, really.
That's kind of the goal, right? That's like, if you are stripping people who, whether it be women, there's non-binary people, there's people who identify as men who have uteruses, right? But if you strip a person who has the capacity to become pregnant of their bodily autonomy, of being able to determine and decide if and when they want to be pregnant, become pregnant, right? Because this is not just an attack on abortion. The fetal personhood law is also attacking birth control and can outlaw certain forms of birth control. But then in the event that they become pregnant, at any point, pre-viability, being able to terminate that pregnancy for reasons that is none of our business and definitely not the government's business. If you can take those rights away, you can coerce people into a future, into a life that they did not plan for, that they potentially do not want. Some of the biggest impacts and most severe impacts of Texas, and I would say the laws that currently and the prohibitions and restrictions that are currently in effect in Arizona, are always going to be the most vulnerable in our communities among us, right? You have young women and young girls, like teenagers. You have women and people who are trying to get out of domestically violent relationships, who are coerced and stuck back in because they're forced to carry to term a pregnancy with their abuser. You have undocumented immigrants. Like, think about all the people in Texas now who on their journey across the border may have been sexually assaulted, who are pregnant, who just because they're detained in Texas now can no longer get an abortion. And of course, just working class women who work hourly wage jobs, who already have one or two children, who can't afford to take a few days off work to go to another state, arrange and pay for childcare, and transport them to another state, pay for a hotel in another state, get an appointment with another doctor in another state, just so that they can get an abortion that they should have a legal right to and they should have access to in their own community. Banning abortion and making it hard to access birth control impacts everyone, no doubt about that. But ultimately, the people who will have less access and who will be hit the hardest are going to be the people who are economically vulnerable, who come from marginalized communities of color, and then, of course, the youngest people among us.
Two of the things that Athena just brought up are, in fact, the legal arguments that were used in the Department of Justice lawsuit against Texas. One is, if a person is detained in Texas under federal custody, whether in ICE or in the Bureau of Prisons or at a military facility, they're entitled to an abortion. And the state of Texas cannot tell the United States that they can't give them one. So that issue of intergovernmental immunity and of interference of states with the government's rights to protect their own citizens who have a constitutional right, that's one of the arguments. And the other argument Athena mentioned is the interstate commerce issue, because if a Texas person has to travel out of state to get their abortion care or their reproductive rights care, then that is a violation. But not only that, there's a penalty for aiding and abetting an abortion. So people who want to send money into Texas to assist women in travel or in motels or in whatever they need, that implicates the banks who transfer money. It implicates Western Union who transfers money. It also is against the insurance companies who might be covering some of the reproductive care. So it implicates all of these big corporations as well. So this is a violation of interstate commerce, among other things. So both of those are arguments in the Department of Justice suit. The other thing that I want to mention about the most vulnerable among us is that the Texas law has a 4-year statute of limitations. So that means that the abusive boyfriend that you left 3 years ago could today sue you for the abortion that you had, or whether he speculated that you had it. Exactly. Now, he can't sue you, but he could sue your sister who drove you to the doctor, or your doctor, or your counselor, or whomever, your domestic violence counselor who helped you get out of the situation. And the person he sues cannot use as a defense that the abortion was legal when they did it, or that the woman consented, or that this case has already been adjudicated. Those are all defenses that are not allowed in the Texas law. Now, this is clearly not legal, clearly unconstitutional, which also the Department of Justice suit points up. And I want to make one more point, and Athena will remember this, I'm sure. A year or two ago, there was a bill, there's a bill every year in the state legislature to further restrict reproductive rights. And one of the things that happened at the committee, I went and tested, must have been a couple of years ago, because you could actually go and testify in a committee. And every person who came up and spoke, oh, we need to restrict. We asked them, well, since you're pro-life, that means that you support increasing money for prenatal care. No. Increasing money for insurance for children. No. Increasing care for school lunches for poor children. No. Increasing money for daycare. No. They did not approve of any assistance to an actual living person, only in restricting the rights of someone who isn't even living and has a 25% chance of never being living. So this is not about pro-life at all. It is about control and nothing but control.
They're the party of pro-birth. They're not pro-life. Prenatal care has been one of my issues for years now, because I looked at the data from the Arizona Department of Health Services, and I looked at access to care. Access to care to first trimester prenatal care has gone down under Doug Ducey and never went back up. And the women that are the hardest hit already are Black women and Native American women and Latinas. white women kind of eschew the data a little bit, but if you look at the women of color, their access to first trimester prenatal care went down dramatically, and it's never gone back up. And so as long as they're trying to push women into having children that they cannot support either financially or emotionally or physically, then they should start that, child care assistance when they say that the fetus is viable. I didn't realize how far the law went in going after people who were helping. I've told this story before. I was a co-ed at Ohio State when Roe v. Wade was passed. And before that, the New York's abortion bill was passed in 1970. Roe v. Wade was 1973. That's exactly when I was in college. And I can't tell you how many women that I saw crying in the hallway of the dormitory when they found out they were pregnant. And then there was a scramble. Who's going to drive this woman to New York? Which was a long ride from Columbus. That's 12, 13 hours. It was just devastating. There was so much jubilation when Roe v. Wade passed because, again, a lot of these women dropped out of college because they couldn't get to New York City or they found out too late. We shouldn't be going back there. In reading the history of Roe v. Wade, it was mostly passed because so many women were dying in illegal abortions. So we're going to go back there? I mean, really, what is the end game here? I agree with you, Diane, that it's about control, but people are going to die. Women are going to die with these laws. Is that really what they want?
Yeah, they don't. And the irony is, referencing Doug Ducey, going back to that, is that meanwhile, he does Orwellian doublespeak and calls himself the most pro-life governor. And when you look at the statistics and the data that you've been researching for years, Rep. Powers Hanley, and then you also look at just his mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and now ushering our children into these environments where we're just seeing a huge spike in infections among our vulnerable youth. It's, they say one thing, but their actions loudly speak another. One thing I do want to highlight from what Diane was saying about the Texas law is the framework in which people can go after not necessarily, the person that had the abortion, but the network that enabled her to have that abortion, whether it be insurance provider, someone, her Lyft driver, her doctor, etc. That framework, I don't think it's the identical framework, but that is also embedded in the bill that passed in Arizona, Senate Bill 1457. But instead of it being a civil liability, instead of it being a civil penalty, it actually creates felonies of the people who support a woman who decides to get an abortion for the reason of there being a genetic abnormality. And so we had those conversations during session. The ACLU actually put together a memo. They looked into that specific issue because we started asking, we're like, hold on a second. This language says that if anyone helps finance or there was another term, it was finance and something else, an abortion, they're getting hit with class 3 felony, which is a very high felony in Arizona. You can go to prison for a very long time. And does that mean insurance companies can be criminally liable? Does that mean if my husband helps me finance this abortion, does my husband then go to jail? The disturbing thing about this is that out of all the prosecutors, only one weighed in informally and was having conversations with legislators behind the scenes. But the rest of the prosecutors would not weigh in on how they would enforce these criminal provisions, attacking and going after the people around you who help you exercise ultimately what is a constitutional right. And so people, if Senate Bill 1457, if the Supreme Court does in Texas's case, the same thing, but to Arizona, the people who will be unsafe in that situation aren't just the people who had the abortion, aren't just the doctors and providers. It's anyone that helps in a financial way. Can that be construed as using your gas to drive someone out of state to get one of these abortions, right? Or to put the woman up in a hotel, right? So, and we're not talking civil at this point. The Arizona law, we're talking criminal. We're talking your law enforcement is knocking at your door.
So in some ways, the Arizona law is just as bad or worse.
Or worse. I want to go back to something you said, Pamela, which is about, I too drove my college roommate to an illegal abortion. I was not allowed to go in, of course. I had to sit out in the car and wait, hoping that she came out alive, which she did. But this was in Los Angeles. I was out of college by that time, but she and I had moved out there together. So we need to remember, and young women need to remember, this wasn't that long ago. You and I are in our 70s, but this wasn't that long ago. that this was a reality and we cannot go back there. And I think we need to turn to remedies and what we should be doing. But I want to bring up one thing, which is that back in 1971, Judith Jarvin Thompson brought up a good thought experiment. And here was the experiment. If you believe life begins at conception, do this thought experiment. Go to the 12th floor of your building, have a petri dish in one hand with a fertilized egg in it, and have a 6-month-old baby in the other hand. Drop them out the window. If the person on the ground can only catch one, which one are they going to catch? Obviously, they're going to catch the baby, right? Not the petri dish. So go back up to your 12th floor. Hold your petri dish with a fertilized egg out the window and hold a woman out the other window and drop them. The Christian nationalists would save the petri dish. I think the rest of us would save the woman. And this was Judith Thompson in 1971. And here we are again.
That's for sure. One of the things I wanted to bring up on 1457 was, in addition to the criminalization of people who are involved in the abortion, is that it makes abortion-inducing drugs illegal through the mail. I was wondering if you could speak to that part of the bill.
So what happened in Texas before the whole women's health decision and clinics shut down across the state is women seeking abortion pills through the mail just skyrocketed, right? And that's one of the things that you'll start seeing in states that start banning abortion, because unfortunately the Supreme Court has indicated that there is an appetite to formally overturn Roe. And as far as I'm concerned, Roe v. Wade is not the law of the land in Texas. And so the Christian nationalists started seeing this workaround that was still safe for women to be able to manage their own abortion care and manage their own termination of their pregnancies. It was another way for the Republicans in Arizona to make sure it was very clear, you cannot get these pills in the mail only if they're for abortions. The two pills, and I always butcher their name, they're not only used for abortion care, right? There's other medical purposes, but it's again, lawmakers legislating healthcare and legislating their morality and abusing the privileges of these public offices to basically restrict the rights and freedoms of their constituents. But it was also with the pre-Roe v. Wade abortion ban, it was also just under that context already illegal, but kind of not, because that law wasn't enforceable. So it was another way for them to be like, we just want to make it very clear, y'all can't do this, which is very unfortunate and very dark, because I think we're heading into a direction next year where if the Republicans have their way backed by the Christian nationalists, abortion can become officially illegal in Arizona.
Recently, or right now, I have not seen a lot of writing or anything on the issue of mailing the pills through the U.S. Postal Service. However, look back at Griswold. That was a Supreme Court case about contraception. And there are laws about what can be mailed through the United States mail and what cannot be. And to not be able to be mailed has to be obscene, or like a bomb or something. But so they sued, saying that the contraceptive information and the contraceptive pills were obscene, and the court ruled they were not. And therefore that information could be sent and the pills could be sent. So like I said, I haven't seen a lot of talk about this on the legal things, but we have to remember we do have that precedent and we do have that case from the past. And what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is support the Women's Health Protection Act, which is H.R. 3755. And it's in Congress. Pelosi is supposed to bring it up for a vote. All of the Arizona Democrats, Senate and House, are on the bill. They're co-sponsors, all of them. So any people who live in a district where they have a Republican congressperson needs to get on that congressperson to sign up to co-sponsor this bill. Good luck on that, but get on them anyway. So that bill, once passed, would then be another route to protect women's reproductive rights and medical care, even if the Supreme Court throws out Roe v. Wade. So we need to get that passed. That is one thing to do. Of course, there's the DOJ suit, and there is a boycott against Texas growing. Oregon has already done it. Portland, Oregon has done it, and other places are looking at boycotting Texas in both trade and travel. So that could be useful as well. And of course, we all know about the upcoming events on October 2nd and 3rd. Or Pamela or Athena, do you want to talk about them?
Really quick, going back on the legislation, though, I just want to emphasize our senior U.S. Senator is also a sponsor on the For the People Act, but without actually abolishing or reforming the filibuster, whether it's the Reproductive Health Act or, also protecting our constitutional right to vote. Those bills are not going anywhere. Appreciate, and I definitely think if you live in a Republican district, reach out to your Republican representatives, but we all live in Arizona and we all should be reaching out to Kyrsten Sinema. Who cares if she's a co-sponsor if she's actually not doing what she needs to get done to get it over the finish line. On October 2nd, the Phoenix Women's March, in conjunction with the National Women's March, is organizing a march.
Well, I've seen two different times. I've seen 9 o'clock and I've seen 10 o'clock, but it is at the Capitol, 1700 West Wash. There's also going to be one in Kingman. There's one in Prescott. I'm sure there's one in Tucson. Do you have information about that? Okay. They're all over the state. But in addition to that, the next day is the Rosie Jimenez Day. Rosie Jimenez was the first woman that we know of who died after the Hyde Amendment was passed and federal funds could no longer be used to support abortion. She died from an illegal abortion, and I believe she had 2 children. But at any rate, that's why we're having the event also on the 3rd. Now, the 2nd is an in-person march for those who can do that. The 3rd is an online forum, discussion panel, that kind of a thing. So there are 2 things in the 2 days. But women have got to do everything. You've got to write letters to the editor. You've got to call your representatives. You've got to register to vote. You've got to sign the petitions that are allowed. You've got to vote. You've got to work on a campaign. You've got to donate money. The abortion fund in Arizona, spends about $5,000 a month supporting women who need abortion. They have to come from rural areas and stay overnight in Phoenix. They have to travel. They lose a day of work. They need to get daycare to take care of the kids they have. They need your support. Planned Parenthood is organizing in rural areas as well. Abortion Fund is organizing in rural areas, and they need your money. We need all of this action to happen right now.
I think it's a very scary time for women. I understand what you're saying about it being all about control, but I don't understand where the men are on this. It's not going to be good for them either. And why are the men not going to jail? It takes 2 people. We're only going after the women. This has always happened in history. Yes, I know it's always happened. It's always been the woman's fault. She didn't keep that aspirin between her knees. I hope that there's more women in Texas that are going to keep that aspirin between their knees or leave. You said something about boycotts of Texas. I think that there could be tourism boycotts for sure. I haven't been to Texas in years, and I don't see any reason to go there. And I think that Arizona is going to have the same problem. Doug Ducey and the Republicans are building our state's economy on growth still. Everybody wants to move here. Well, you know what? You can't spell crazy without AZ, and if Arizona gets crazy enough and we lose our water, nobody's going to be coming here for tourism or to move. And so there's a tipping point on how reactionary the Republicans can be, I hope, and still get elected. I just think it's horrible for women. I'm afraid for my granddaughters. I have 3 granddaughters. And so, I'm not going to have any more children. I've been there, done that. But I'm worried about the women of the future and what their future is going to be like. And where do you go? I thought about this. I moved to Arizona when I was 30 years old and single. And it's like, would I do that today? I don't know. Would I move to Texas? No way would I move to Texas. There are so many states that are doing these types of bills. Then where do women go? I really think that women have some big decision points, especially single women.
Right. Instead of this being a constitutional right that is afforded to every American citizen and resident of this country, regardless of what state you live in, when you look at what Doug Ducey filed with the Supreme Court, the amicus brief, and Mark Bronovich, they're arguing that no, this should not be a constitutional right anymore. We should get to pick what kind of health care and what kind of freedoms the people in our states, state by state, get. And if you live in a state that's backwards and wants to control your body and wants to empower domestic violence abusers and rapists, like, tough luck, right? Ultimately, so I think that is part of the crux. And the last thing, bold action I'd like to see from the federal government. I don't know, we'll see. We'll see. I can dream. But without fixing the Supreme Court, it's not just abortion rights that is going back to the states and where we're going to have these fights again, right? We're talking elections and voting. we're talking, I just can't see a world where the Supreme Court continues to uphold marriage equality. And there's just so many fundamental rights that we have taken for granted that were hard fought so that we can live in a society where we've achieved this level of equality. We still need more rights, but at least we've achieved this baseline. But this Supreme Court is not going to respect any of that, as they've proven with Texas and ignoring decades of precedent and decades of their own rule of law.
We obviously cannot ignore the hypocrisy of the Christian nationalists standing there refusing vaccines, saying, my body, my right. But when it's a woman standing there saying, my body, my right, they say, no, not you. But in fact, the refusal of vaccines is a public health matter. It infects other people, it harms other people, it kills other people, it harms the economy, it overflows the hospitals, it hurts the healthcare system, and on and on and on. It has other repercussions. The woman choosing to have or not have a child has repercussions for very few people, herself and maybe one other person and maybe a few other people, but nothing like what the public health concerns are for the people who refuse to take vaccines, which is nowhere near as invasive as having to carry a child for 9 months and have it for the rest of your life. And I recently saw a cartoon that said, you think it's too invasive for a 12-year-old child to wear a mask at school, but if she gets pregnant, you will force her to have a baby.
Exactly. In fact, one of the more stunning moments at the Arizona House in 2021, and Athena will remember this, was when Representative John Fillmore got up and gave a "My Body, My Choice" speech about wearing a mask or getting a vaccine. And I think you, Athena, stood up and said, well, I'm glad to see Representative Fillmore has become pro-choice. But that is exactly where they are. In fact, Fitzsimmons, who is a cartoonist down here for the Arizona Daily Star, had a cartoon about this. He has a man in a MAGA hat and a t-shirt, and he's got a sign that's saying, no mask, my body, my choice. And then the other hand, it says, no abortion, her body, my choice.
And we also can't forget the famous clip of Kamala Harris asking, name me one law that controls men's bodies. Name me one. And of course, they could not. They could not.
Do you have anything else you want to add?
Because the crux of the argument is that we have to force people to continue pregnancy because there's a life at stake. But, and you know, Diane, I agree with you. A lot of that's tied to religious dogma and ideology. But then, like, why is it then that the government can't compel someone who's dead to then donate organs that are good because there's a life at stake who can actually continue to live that's contingent on those organs? And it comes back to bodily autonomy, control, and choice. Even in your death, you still have that right. But again, if you're a woman and if it involves pregnancy, suddenly you lose that right, which it makes absolutely no sense. Dead male bodies have more control over what happens to them than alive female bodies. It's just wild.
And I want to end with one thing. Do not depend on the law to save you. The law is not the solution. It is a tactic. It is a way we get to where we want to go, but it's not where we want to go. You see that the law can be changed. The law can be thrown out. The law can be undermined. So yes, lawyers are valuable. Yes, what we do is good. And yes, it's necessary. It's not the solution. You people have to rise up, stand up, fight, and get your rights. We will work, we will help, we will do what we can with the skills we have. And Athena and Pam, as both legislators, will do what they can, but you have to stand up and defend yourself.
That's an excellent point to end on. I'm so glad you women could join me today. And thanks for the discussion. I think this is important information, and we need to pay attention to these red states and what they're doing to suppress women. And as you said earlier in the discussion, Athena, they are not only suppressing our reproductive rights, they are suppressing our voting rights. They don't want us to have a say in this. They know what they're doing is wrong. They still want to be reelected, so they're going to rig the system even more. And it's a scary time in the United States for our democracy and for our rights. And thank you so much for being fighters. Thanks so much for tuning in to A View from the Left Side today. If you enjoyed the show, please consider liking this podcast on social media and becoming a subscriber. This is Representative Pam Powers-Hanley signing off. Until next time, please take care of yourself, stay healthy, and stay vigilant.